Hello, hello, welcome back. We are going to be doing a Night Goblin today, one of my absolute favorite miniatures from when I was a kid. And I've mentioned multiple times that when I got into this hobby, I was actually fairly young. I painted my first miniature when I was 11, way back when, longer back than I care to admit. But I think that would be, what would it be? It would be 1980, no, 1992 would be the first miniature that I painted. Or rather, that would be, yeah, the first time I painted a miniature. And back then, it wasn't even a Warhammer miniature; it was a Hero Quest figure. And I loved Hero Quest dearly, and I wasn't quite ready for Warhammer Fantasy, but it took a while. Well, it didn't take too long, to be perfectly honest, before I finally picked up some of my first miniatures. And this guy was amongst them. This Night Goblin, was absolutely like a standout miniature for me from my collection. It was just too cute, and something about that finger as well was really amusing to me. And it's still amusing to me even now. So, just in case you think I've grown out of this stuff, absolutely not. Yeah, this Night Goblin, sculpted in 1993 by Kev Adams, goes on to become the definitive look for Night Goblins, or rather the range that he belongs to, which I think he's got something like over 10 of these guys, including command groups and so on, making it more like closer to 15. And these Night Goblins go on to be the first and definitive look for Night Goblins. Prior to this, I think Games Workshop did do generic Goblin models that look more like step um, figures. So, for example, they had like furry hats, they had leather jerkins, they had weapons that were a little bit more generic, like just your standard axes and clubs, that sort of thing. But this is the first time effectively that we're seeing a Night Goblin, and Kev Adams, wonderful talent that he is, basically sat down and sculpted the entire range by himself, setting the look of Night Goblins for a long time to come. So yeah, this guy ends up having a really big impact on my desire to collect an Orc and Goblin army, because I was 11 and this sort of thing was really funny to me. I really love it still because this guy is quite special. And over the years, I guess you see Games Workshop gradually move away from the more risque depictions of, well, anything. So it's kind of amazing to have a miniature like flashing his middle finger right at, us, the viewer, and presumably whoever the Night Goblins are standing like up against as well, because that's just the mood that Night Goblins had, right? That was just the energy that these little chaps had. They were always going to be outclassed by anything, but they were sassy little gits, and I love them for it. This model, with his little finger, was one of a set of models armed with hand weapons. These Night Goblins basically come with three weapons, three different options as in overall. So you've got like some armed with spears, you've got some armed with hand weapons, and then you've got at least one or two little guys armed with great weapons, which back in the day was an option. I've previously mentioned that I thought that these guys couldn't actually get weapon options, or that they were restricted. I thought that was how they differentiated elite units from less elite units back in the day. This is not the case. I have since found that practically any unit, regardless of cost, could really be often armed with things like great weapons, and additional hand weapons are rare, but great weapons, hand weapons and shields, that kind of thing, were fairly common choices around this time. So these guys could be armed to the teeth, such as they were. And the best part is that it wouldn't break the bank because these guys aren't worth much in combat. But they do give a really good showing. And frankly, these chaps had something that no other unit could boast at the time, or at least could boast for that points cost, which is they had fanatics. And fanatics are just one of those little gotcha surprises that you expect Night Goblins to have, simply because your average Night Goblin is really, really cheap, and then you've got the fanatic on top of it, which is just to give things like Chaos Warriors, High Elves, and all these superior enemy armies something to think about as they approach your cheapo Night Goblins. Because even though these guys were what, like maybe 2 points, 2.5 points, depending on what equipment you gave them, essentially they could always harbor a nasty surprise for practically any unit. And Night Goblin fanatics would be shoved out of these units at 8-inch range, which is, when you think about it, just around march distance or charge distance for an enemy unit, meaning they could not approach within that distance of this unit without triggering like Night Goblin fanatics to be hurled out at them at breakneck speed. And you will roll 2d6 to see how far they go, and if they were to contact any unit, well, that poor unit is going to end up taking d6 strength 5 hits, which is enough to pop most enemy units. And worst of all, those units would have no armor save. Or best of all, if you're the Night Goblin in the equation and loving the carnage that you're causing, that your little like green terrors are causing amongst your typically much more expensive and much less expendable enemy. So yeah, Night Goblins were always capable of punching above their weight, and I guess that's why this miniature so wonderfully typifies that attitude, because he is flashing his middle finger right at you, right at the enemy, kind of giving you those like cheeky playground vibes, and I love them for it. The later Night Goblin versions that came out, I guess they all omitted this kind of cheekiness and appeal. Although there is another set of Night Goblins which came out around 6th edition, which I dearly love as well. The only downside to those is that the main infantry were all plastic models, which kind of made them a little bit chunky and out of proportion. But you can't always have it all, right? So that's how it is. Anyway, a little bit on the colors I'm using. So for skin for orcs and goblins, I really like using bright colors on the skins of these guys, simply because they are green skins. Therefore, I feel that it really should be one of the big selling points of the range, especially when viewed from afar. So what I've done is I've gone ahead to use the brightest contrast green I could find, which is striking scorpion green. It is really nuclear colored, and I kind of love it for that. So we're going to be adding highlights to this. So the final look is going to look a little bit more naturalistic, a little bit less over the top vibrant, but still very, very discernible from a table's length away or a table's width away. For the cloaks, of course, it's going to be black. So here again, my favorite black is Black Templar, because it's got a slightly blue tinge, especially when you drop a little bit of white or Vallejo silver grey to highlight it. So that's just an option that I prefer. I'm going to clean up his foot over here because I want to do his shoes next in bright red, simply because that was how it was done in the day. This model is going to have red eyes, so it really helps to have small little pops of red somewhere else on the model to, well, bring out the color in his eyes. So yeah, I think he's looking pretty decent. I'm going to drop a little bit more silver on the pommel of his dagger. And there's not a lot to painting this model, which is great because you typically need to have like a billion of these chaps. These guys, like I mentioned, would clock about 2.5 points each. More if you give them like weapon options like shields and light armor and so on. All of these things really kind of made them not amazing fighters, but it did help them sort of stay a little bit longer on the battlefield, and were well worth the tiny amount of points outlay, especially if you were going to be able to corral your opponent into a narrow zone. A little bit more black around his chin, because I think I missed it a little bit earlier, and I think we can move on to the next thing, which is to paint some of the details dangling around his waist. Night Goblins don't have a lot of detail going on them in general, so it's well worth the time and effort spent picking out these little bits, because generally speaking they could be finished fairly quickly anyway, so it's worthwhile doing what we can to help these little guys stand out. As mentioned, we're going to do the shoes in red, so let's jump right in with our typical red mix. This is Blood Angels red plus Gryphcharger orange, 1:1, and you can sort of see how a tiny little spot of color, especially in conjunction with the bright green and the black cloaks, really kind of makes the entire model pop immediately. And it doesn't take a lot of red, just a small amount here and there. We might as well do his eyes while we're at it. So this is not the ideal brush for this, but I think we'll be just fine because the eyes are actually really nicely sculpted on these figures. There we go. So that works for us, and we'll be dropping a little dot of maybe Vallejo Ice Yellow in later to kind of finish things off. A little bit of Nazdreg Yellow would not go amiss, picking out the actual drawstrings of this robe. And we've got these little pouches, which I think we can pick out in maybe Fire Slayer Flesh. We'll have a think about that. Right now, let's jump in and grab a little bit. Well, first of all, I'm going to switch out my brush because I think I want a slightly finer brush. These guys are very, very small indeed. So a little bit of ice yellow. We're going to drop in the eyes first, since we've got ice yellow on our brush, unadulterated by any green or any other color. So let's very carefully dollop some into his pupils, his eyeballs rather. That's one, and the other. Not ideal. I think we need to clean it up slightly. But you get the idea. Sometimes it's good to get these things out of the way early on. Just grab a bit of red. Like so. And then we'll come back in and we'll kind of highlight around it, so we'll be fine. So a bit of striking scorpion green into this yellow. Now, the reason why I like using Vallejo colors to mix highlights into contrast paint is because, well, Vallejo colors tend to be very, very thick indeed. And that's just the perfect thing to fix the consistency when mixing highlights out of contrast paints. So let's just clean up that cheek. There we go. I could have taken one more step to clean up that little splotch, but I think there's no need to do it when the highlight's going to do the bulk of the work anyway. And to be honest, a little bit of red around that eye does not go amiss. It kind of makes him look like he's missing sleep, which, let's be honest, all night goblins technically in broad daylight would be squinting and sweating because their eyes simply aren't accustomed to the bright lights. Night goblins, I think, are what happens when you let Games Workshop come up with something original and new and take an existing concept and have their own take on it. And to my mind, it's when Games Workshop does original stuff like this, or sort of takes a pre-existing concept like goblins and sort of spins it in a new direction, is when I think Games Workshop is absolutely at their best. If I'm to be honest, I think this may have more to do with the way basically Kev Adams went ahead and developed this concept, because I believe there was a lot less oversight over the studio at the time, other than to give the core concept or an idea, and then you sort of let your designers come up with whatever visuals suit the range of models based on what you've written. But I think this approach really helps come up with some pretty original stuff with a minimum of, I would say, corporate meddling, but that's a question for a different kind of discussion. So, back of the hand, as always, these are wonderfully sculpted. Everything is in its own place and it's right where it needs to be. And the hand with the middle finger, to be perfectly honest, is fairly nicely articulated. It's kind of got everything where it needs to be and has nice, defined, sharp knuckles. So that's just a joy to paint, really. A little bit of touch up with green will be needed, but that's usually the way we do things. We usually knock back the highlights a little bit, sort of clean them up a little bit and help them blend in a little bit better. Cool. So let's jump right in to do a little bit of non-oil on his little dagger. And just to put things in perspective, this little sword, I suppose, would be the size of a dagger for just about any other model in the range. There are dark elf models, there are high elf models, which are not a lot, kind of the same size as a human, right? Who have basically daggers this size, and that just drives home how incredibly small and cute these guys are. Really like these models and the way they were essentially a completely different scale to any other model out at the time. They really kind of set that lower bar for what a small weedy enemy would be. Despite this, they were their wonderful toughness 3, although their weapon skill kind of did suffer a little bit. I guess it's hard to hit something when you're small and tiny. Now I'm just grabbing a little bit of Vallejo Silver Grey, mixed it with the Black Templar to get a rudimentary highlight, sort of blue-grey color. Very little blue in it because the Black Templar blue is very, very subtle. And then we're just sort of adding these highlights. Again, these can be a little bit on the coarse side because we're going to be coming in to clean this up. So if you're not the kind of person who like puts down pinstripe thin highlights perfectly, unerringly wherever they need to go, what you can do is do what I do, which is to apply a slightly bolder, slightly coarser read, slightly messier highlight, and then just work with the assumption that you're going to be coming in with a little bit of the Black Templar contrast later to clean up around it. Saves a bit of mental load, I feel, because there's a lot less strain and, shall we say, performance anxiety because you're trying your absolute hardest to get the highlight to go where it needs to go. Let's not even talk about the fact that I'm trying to do this on camera. It's a whole different level of fun. But yeah, it's bad enough when you're sort of painting this and you're expecting it to go really well, and maybe it's midway through a session and your eyes are getting a little bit tired. But yeah, do this, make it a bit thicker. It's fine, it's not going to hurt anybody, but make sure you come back in with the contrast paint and to sort of trim this down a little bit later, and the model will just look just dandy, no issues at all. Another thing you could do is to go one up on the highlights, which I'm going to do now. Double down a little bit, make it nice and bright right on the tips so that your eyes have something to be drawn away from the imperfections. Kind of like what I'm doing now, I'm putting a little bit of this right on the tips, and just making sure that they kind of go where they need to go. Now for this kind of thing, if you're going to be putting a little sort of emphasis highlight where you want to draw the eye away from maybe the less neat parts of the model, make very sure that you're doing this with a really good brush. Take a deep breath and just kind of drop them in where they need to go. This one, you do need to put a little bit more effort and a little bit more concentration into it. But let's be honest, you're covering very little surface area indeed. So all things considered, even though it's a little bit more of a strain on your concentration, you'll be done really quick as well. And frankly, a little bit goes a long way. So there we go. I think he's starting to look pretty handsome. I need to clean up parts of his face where I kind of messed it up a little bit earlier. Not to worry, it happens to the best of us. And he's got this zip, which I think I want a little bit more definition around, and give it a wipe to sort of take off some of the contrast paint, like so, just to make sure that it's nice and visible and nasty. Goblins typically had quite a lot of these, well, orcs and goblins actually. I just think it was Kev Adams style to put on a lot of these like spots and pimples and like little skin details to a lot of his miniatures, and that's kind of great because compared to sort of the silky smooth complexions of like say the humans or the high elves, these guys are just a little bit grotty, a little bit mangled, not great condition, and I imagine these guys sit in their holes all day drinking lots and lots of coffee just to keep vigil through the long nights and to do their work in the dark corners of the Warhammer world. And when they come up to the surface, well, no one likes a face full of sun when you've kind of been staying up late at night working in your dark burrow. So last thing I want to do is to put a little bit of our gold mix. Our gold mix is typically Nazdreg Yellow plus Seraphim Sepia, 50-50, but lately I've been considering whether I want to go a little bit heavier on the Seraphim Sepia, just to add a little bit more orangey brown into the mix, make it slightly less yellow, because I find that if I apply one coat, it can come across as a little bit too orangey yellow. Your mileage will vary, of course. It really depends on the kind of gold that you're trying to depict. But if you're trying to do like gold on, well, bad guys, I suppose, like this Night Goblin, you might find that this looks a little bit too yellow and clean and polished. Whereas really what might be better is something that's a little bit dirtier and a little bit more stained and scuffed. Just perfect for a little Night Goblin who's been like scurrying around in the dark, just collecting mushrooms, getting ready to put together a unit of Night Goblin fanatics in his Night Goblin regiments to be the nightmare of any Chaos Warrior or Proud High Elf. Right, so I think we are very close to done. I think what I'm going to do is to just come in with a little bit more Ice Yellow to really hammer the point home with his finger. This tiny amount of paint, again, much like we did with the grey, with the pure Vallejo Silver Grey on his robe, is really just on the very extreme point. So just on the knuckles, just on that spot on his nose. Now you know I'm concentrating because I'm not actually talking much. But yeah, that's a thing on this channel, I suppose. His eye. That looks alright. Lower lip, which is nice and defined. And a little bit on his eye. He doesn't have eyebrows, but his eye folds, I guess. And his hands. His adorable little hands. And a little bit on his forearm over here. Points of his elbow, thumb, knuckles, all these little bits. Really quick to do, but they really make your model pop from afar, so very worthwhile to spend the time doing. Yeah, very worthwhile indeed. So just cleaning up the eyes slightly. I do like the fact that there's a little bit of red around his eye. That really just adds to the flavor. So the next time you do an eye, maybe consider just washing it with a slightly different color that works around the color scheme. You could do, for example, like a blue wash or a dark brown wash into the sockets of a human skin toned miniature with fairly light skin. And then you can kind of leave a little bit of that as you add the pupils and, you know, the eyeballs and pupils when you paint that on. Goblins in particular work well with a bit of a reddish tone, reddish brown tone, so just the red in the eyes just reminds you that this guy really should be underground and he's not too happy to be on the surface. Okay, so I hope this has been in focus the whole time because this is a tiny little dude. I hope I've not been painting it too far from the camera. A little bit of silver just to clean up his weapon and to make it look wicked sharp. There we go. And maybe a little touch on the corners of his weapon, which is fairly rudimentary, like I said, more like a knife really, but still fairly well made for a goblin. Right, cool. So as mentioned earlier, we're going to come back in with a little bit of the original striking scorpion green, just to clean up some areas around his face. Maybe tone down some of the highlights, because it's easy to go overboard with the highlights I found, especially when the models are as nice and defined as this one. So just come back in, make sure that you haven't been a little bit too zealous, too overzealous with your highlights, and to make sure that, you know, it keeps the proportion of bright and dark spots to the correct amount. So tone down a little bit of your highlights, and you find that the model becomes smoother and looks way better in photographs as a result. Yeah, the last thing I want to do is to jump onto a little bit of Black Templar again. Again, just to neaten up some of the highlights. You can work on these fairly quickly, apply fairly rough highlights like I mentioned, and then just make sure that you come in and put the time to clean this up later. It doesn't take a lot of effort in my opinion, and frankly, just this little bit to help some of these thicker lines kind of blend, especially at their base, helps a lot to make the model look a lot more coordinated and, well, just a little bit more finessed, I suppose. And you can take a little bit of time with this if you want, but really it doesn't take much time at all to make sure that everything blends together in a way that works on the miniature, and you don't have any sections of the highlights where it kind of draws the eye a little bit too much. Just going to fill in that little space around his mouth so that we get to see that lovely grin on camera. and I think we'll do it. Alright guys, hope you've enjoyed watching this as much as I've enjoyed painting this little chap. Just a quick video today. This guy wasn't the hardest in the world to paint, but he was really enjoyable to do, so I hope you had a good time watching me do this guy. And if you can get hold of some of these models, yeah, definitely give them a shot. They are easy to paint, easy to get done, and they are really just a joy to have on the tabletop. Plus, you might catch sight of a nice opponent reaction to just the rudest little goblin ever made. Okay, guys, have a good one. Cheers. Like, comment, subscribe if you're into that sort of thing. If not, I'll see you in the next video. Love you all. Bye bye.